The sun's rays lazily filtered through the large, dusty windows of the shop, flooding the floor with golden light. The air was warm and slightly spicy, the kind you only feel in the last days of summer. I sat by the window, basking in the warmth, knowing that soon it would give way to the cold breath of autumn. Summer was fading, and with it, the lightness that had accompanied me these past few months. My mother and I had recently talked about returning to school. The semester was approaching, but school life seemed distant, almost unreal to me. I was already fully immersed in another magical world, and the thirst for adventure pulsed in my veins. Yet sometimes, like now, I just wanted to stop and rest. I sat by the window watching the occasional passers-by who moved back and forth as if they didn't notice the shop at all. For a long time I suspected there was some sort of magical barrier over this place. The shop simply hid itself from prying eyes. Only those meant to find it ever entered. It had been 4 days since the last visitor. The silence in the shop was almost tangible. I enjoyed the peace, but one thought gnawed at me. Mr. Mortimer was missing. He had been gone far too long, and everyone, myself included, was worried. Especially Yorick. He roamed the shop, dusting here and rearranging things there, clearly unable to sit still. Ever since he acquired a body, he had longed to speak with his master, but the opportunity hadn't yet presented itself. Thomas, the werewolf, sat nearby, calm and collected on the outside, but I knew he was worried too. He had recently visited his daughter at the nursing home. They often spent time together, though I couldn't help but notice how his gaze turned distant when talk of family came up. I thought about the events of the past few days. We had traveled back in time, met the young owner of the shop. That moment still lingered in my mind. I saw the demon's energy flow into the young Mortimer. Could that have been the event that awakened his powers, making him who he is? But was Mr. Mortimer a vampire in the traditional sense? Did he drink blood? That seemed unlikely to me. He was the kindest person I'd ever met. But the woman who knew him in the past hinted that he had dark secrets. I wouldn't have pressed him. Everyone has their own secrets, and it's best not to stir up someone else's. My thoughts were interrupted by a soft tap on the window. I turned and saw a seagull on the sill. It sat there, waiting, with a letter tied around its neck. Surprised, I got up and opened the window. The gull wasted no time, flying in and landing beside me, waiting for me to take the parcel. I untied the envelope and the bird immediately took off, disappearing into the autumn sky. The others, hearing the rustle, came over and asked what it was. I just shrugged and showed them the letter, not fully understanding what was happening. After a quick glance at the parchment, I decided to open it. Inside was just one sentence, written in neat but hurried script. "Please save me." We exchanged surprised glances. Silence hung in the air, and I, unsure of what to do next, turned the parchment over in my hands, hoping to find more clues. But the paper seemed ordinary. No marks, no hint of the sender, just that brief, desperate message. "There's nothing else here," I said, somewhat disappointed. "What could it mean?" Yorick stroked his beard, squinting in thought. After a few seconds of silence, he finally spoke. "Maybe there's a hidden message." With those words, he headed toward the shelves. I watched as he deliberately moved objects around, clearly knowing what he was looking for. Finally, he pulled out a small, strange item from behind some old books and returned to us. In his hands was a magnifying glass, but not an ordinary one. It was made of the purest crystal, its facets shimmering with light, scattering in all directions. When the light passed through the crystal, it seemed to bend and break into hundreds of beams, making it impossible to read through. The crystal was framed in silver metal and had a wooden handle. Yorick directed the magnifying glass at the parchment. What happened next made us all freeze. The light passing through the crystal's facets fell onto the paper, and slowly, as if obeying some ancient spell, symbols began to appear. We all leaned forward, and after a few moments, the symbols took clear shape. A bright inscription emerged on the paper, reading, "The Witch's Fair." The name sounded mysterious and ominous, as if its very meaning was shrouded in secrecy. Next to the inscription appeared a strange symbol, a feather beautifully etched and seemingly glowing against the parchment. I frowned, wondering what it could mean. Why a feather? How did it connect to the plea for help? I turned to Yorick, frowning, and asked, "What does all this mean?" Yorick, suddenly animated as if he were in his element, began speaking like a walking encyclopedia of magical events. The Witch's Fair. It's an event that happens only once a year, and every time it's in a new location. The inscription we saw, it's both the key and the map that will lead us there. The Witch's Fair is the gathering place for all sorts of witches, wizards, sorcerers, and, of course, those hunting for rare magical artifacts and creatures. It's quite the curious event, he smiled, clearly intrigued. You can find anything there, from ancient spells to creatures you'd never see anywhere else. But as for the feather we saw next to the inscription, Yorick paused, thinking for a moment. I'm not sure yet. We'll need to figure that out. I listened in silence, contemplating what to do next. Should we go to this fair or ignore the message? But it soon became clear. I couldn't just turn my back on this. Mr. Mortimer had entrusted us with the shop, and the one rule here had always been clear. Never refuse help when it's asked for. I turned to Yorick and said firmly, "Looks like we'll have to go." He nodded enthusiastically, excited about the journey ahead. I haven't been to the fair in years, he admitted, smiling. I wouldn't mind seeing it again. We turned to Thomas to hear his decision. He looked at us calmly and slowly shook his head. I'll stay here, he said quietly. I need to keep an eye on the shop, and I have to visit my daughter. And so, the plan was set. How are we going to find this place? I asked Yorick. As usual, he had already thought it through. He picked up the magnifying glass again and, uttering some ancient words in a forgotten language, aimed it back at the parchment. What happened next felt like magic. The writing on the paper began to shift, flickering and transforming. Within moments, a map with directions appeared before us. There it is, Yorick said, pointing to the map. The fair is being held in New York at an abandoned subway station. New York? I was surprised. The location seemed far too ordinary for such a mystical event. We decided not to waste any time and set off immediately. Yorick, concentrating, pulled out small jars filled with different colored powders and began mixing them. I had never seen teleportation powder being made before, and noticing my curious gaze, Yorick seemed a bit self-conscious. The master does this in an instant, he said, casting his eyes downward. He knows the proportions by heart and never makes a mistake. But I have to carefully measure the ingredients, or we could end up in the wrong place. I simply nodded, continuing to watch the process. Yorick carefully measured the colorful powders with a small spoon, weighing them on an old-fashioned scale. Sometimes he had to add or remove tiny amounts to ensure the mix was just right. It looked like an alchemical ritual, an ancient and mysterious craft requiring patience and precision. When the mixture was finally ready, Yorick carefully sprinkled the powder into the air, and at that moment, a portal opened before us. On the other side, I saw a deserted street lined with old buildings and in the distance the lights of a highway where people and cars moved. Yorick pursed his lips in mild annoyance as he looked at the scene. "Missed it by a bit," he grumbled, "but it seems close enough." He jumped through the portal without hesitation, and I followed, checking my magic pouch hanging from my belt first. Thomas, who stayed behind at the shop, silently watched us go, offering a final wish for us to be careful. The next moment, the world spun around me, and everything went dark. I felt a slight dizziness, as if the space around me had momentarily lost its familiar shape and boundaries. When I finally opened my eyes, I realized I was in a narrow alleyway. Trash cans lined the walls, and at first glance the place seemed completely abandoned. There was no one around, which was a relief. At least I hoped no one had seen us. Yorick stood nearby, and as soon as I appeared, he waved his hand, and the portal dissipated, vanishing as suddenly as it had opened. We stepped out onto the street. I quickly realized we were in the heart of the city. People were bustling around, hurrying about their business, paying no attention to us. Storefronts glimmered. The air was filled with the smell of street food and exhaust fumes. The noise and chaos were an unbearable contrast to the quiet we had just left behind. We needed to find the abandoned subway station, but I had no idea where it was. Yorick, on the other hand, seemed confident. He clearly knew where to go. We walked for several blocks, turned a corner, and passed by old apartment buildings. The streets became narrower and more deserted, and soon we turned down another alley. Among the dumpsters and cracked walls, Yorick found a manhole. He pulled at the cover, and with a loud creak it swung aside, revealing a dark entrance into the sewers. "You first," Yorick said, motioning for me to go down. I hesitated for a moment, peering into the dark hole. The damp, musty smell wafted up from below, but there was no other way. Gathering my courage, I began to descend the rusty ladder, and soon found myself in a sewage tunnel. Yorick followed behind me. We walked through the narrow, damp passage, illuminated only by the dim light of a lantern Yorick had pulled from his pocket. Water splashed somewhere in the distance, and each of our steps echoed loudly as if the tunnel itself was watching us. After several minutes of wandering among pipes and metal grates, Yorick suddenly stopped at a wall. He inspected it closely and then pressed one of the bricks. With a groan, as if it were sighing, a hidden passage opened. Behind it was a steep staircase leading down. We began our descent, each step echoing loudly in the narrow, damp space. The staircase was old, its metal railing rusted, and the steps were slippery in places, covered with mold. The deeper we went, the stronger the smell of dampness and decay became, until finally, we reached a massive iron door. Without a word, Yorick pulled at the rusty handle, and the door, creaking and groaning, slowly opened. Beyond it lay the subway tracks. We stepped onto the cold, cracked rails, and the tunnel swallowed us in its darkness. We walked slowly along the tracks, alert and ready for anything. Around us, there was dead silence, and only our footsteps echoed against the stone walls. Suddenly, lights flickered in the distance, and a faint rumble reached us. "A train," Yorick said quietly. Wasting no time, we rushed toward the nearest opening in the wall. Pressed into the narrow space, we watched with bated breath as a train emerged from the darkness, speeding by. It raced past, and the gust of air it left behind sent my hair flying. When the train disappeared around the bend, leaving only a faint hum in its wake, we cautiously stepped out of our hiding spot and continued along the tracks. Soon, we reached a part of the tracks that seemed long abandoned. The rails were rusted, the walls worn, and there was an eerie stillness, as if the place had been forgotten by everyone. Suddenly, out of the darkness, an old man appeared. He looked incredibly ancient, as if he was 100 years old or more. Hunched over, he walked with a cane, dressed in an old-fashioned frock coat and a worn hat. His steps were quick and unexpectedly confident for someone his age, and I realized I wouldn't be able to catch up with him no matter how hard I tried. "Follow him," Yorick whispered, nodding toward the old man. "He'll lead us where we need to go." The old man didn't look back and didn't acknowledge our presence, as if we didn't exist for him. He just walked ahead, sure of his path. We quickened our pace, trying not to lose sight of him, and soon he led us to a hidden, abandoned station, forgotten by the world and its purpose. The station was shrouded in twilight, its walls covered in ancient graffiti and cobwebs. We followed the old man, never letting him out of our sight. When he stepped onto the platform, he approached the wall and suddenly stopped. The floor, laid out with large square tiles, seemed ordinary, but the old man clearly knew what to do. He carefully stepped onto one tile, then another, took a step to the left, and moved onto the next tile. I held my breath, watching his every move. Then, as if by magic, the old man vanished into thin air. I stood there, mouth agape, unable to believe my eyes. "We need to follow his steps," Yorick said quietly, nodding toward the tiles. I focused on the combination the old man had used, and holding my breath, began mimicking his movements. As I stepped onto the final tile, the world around me suddenly shifted. So abruptly, in fact, that I was momentarily disoriented. Beside me, Yorick materialized, and together, we found ourselves in a completely different place. Before us stretched a bustling street inside a massive cavern. I craned my neck and could barely make out the ceiling's vaulted heights. The cave was so vast that its boundaries blurred in a hazy distance, and the light, it seemed like sunlight, though there was no way real sunlight could reach here. Yet everything was bathed in a warm, soft glow, as if it were daytime. The cavern was enormous, and its walls were hidden behind endless rows of stalls and wagons that stretched as far as the eye could see. Between them, people bustled about, browsing the goods, and I quickly realized this was the fair, but not an ordinary one. Many of the creatures here were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Tall, squat, covered in fur with strange eyes. Some moved gracefully and silently, like shadows, while others were massive and lumbering, heavy like stone. We moved forward, and I couldn't help but glance around, trying to take in everything this mysterious market had to offer. Each stall was manned by vendors displaying their wares, many of which were unlike anything found in ordinary shops. At one stall, tiny glass vials rested on cushions, and inside them it seemed like miniature clouds or whirlwinds swirled. They glowed softly, their movements mesmerizing. Beside them were strange devices resembling clocks, though their hands moved chaotically, as if time operated by different rules for them. Another stall featured metal gloves and gauntlets. They looked heavy, but they were crafted with incredible precision. I noticed one customer try on a glove, and as he clenched his fist, the glove seemed to come alive. adjusting perfectly to his hand. A bit further along, I saw glowing plants, flowers emitting a faint luminescence. I watched as one of the sellers leaned down to them and whispered something, and the flowers seemed to respond, swaying gently and changing the color of their petals. As we passed another row, I spotted a vendor showing off massive, ancient books. Their covers were cracked, and the pages looked as though they might crumble to dust at the slightest touch. Yet there was something about these books that drew the eye. They seemed to hold the weight of millennia of wisdom within them. We kept walking, and I couldn't tear my gaze away from the strange and magical items. Each one held a certain mystique, a secret, but I couldn't figure out what it was. I could only guess at their purpose. But the fair pulled me deeper into its mystery, and I felt like even more wondrous things awaited us ahead. As we walked through the fair, Yorick looked unusually focused. He was clearly searching for someone or something among the traders, even as he told me the history of this enigmatic place. "It all started over 100 years ago," he began, never taking his eyes off the surroundings. "There was a man named Sebastian Knoxwell who discovered that certain objects possessed magical properties. He began collecting these artifacts, first for himself, but eventually he realized there were others around the world who owned similar items. However, these people kept their treasures hidden, passing them down through generations. Soon, Knoxwell realized that they too had something to gain by trading or selling these items. That's when he had the idea to create a fair where owners of such artifacts could safely make deals. I listened intently, glancing at the rare goods and strange creatures around us. The air was thick with the scent of spices, leather, and metal. "Humans don't possess magic directly," Yorick continued. "They always need artifacts to use it. No one knows where these items come from or how they're made. It's one of the secrets that remains unsolved." "Over time, the fair attracted more than just humans," Yorick said, nodding toward a stall where strange snake-like creatures stood. "Other beings who live among us in secret also came here to buy and sell their wares. The fair grew, and Knoxwell became more powerful. Now he leads the Order, a secret society that ensures the truth about magical artifacts doesn't come to light. The rules aren't very strict, but when someone breaks them seriously, a special squad steps in." I thought about what he'd said about the artifacts and the Order. Remembering the recent events with Chronix, who had caused quite a stir on the streets, I asked, "Why didn't that squad visit our shop when Chronix caused trouble?" Yorick smiled briefly before explaining, "Mr. Mortimer has a special status. His influence is so great that they usually don't bother him. If something serious happens, the Order cleans up the mess, erasing memories or, if necessary, covering the tracks. They're also responsible for finding magical artifacts that unexpectedly appear in the hands of ordinary people. Sometimes they buy them, other times they steal them if necessary." Suddenly, Yorick stopped at a small wagon with a stall displaying strange items, crystals glowing softly and antique jewelry. He examined the display carefully, then nodded at me before stepping inside. I followed him, still digesting everything I had just heard. We stepped into the cramped, shadowy room and began looking around, trying to make sense of where we were. The shelves were cluttered with all sorts of things, from ancient books to strange artifacts that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Unable to hide my curiosity, I asked Yorick, "Who are we looking for?" Yorick glanced at me out of the corner of his eye and calmly replied, "There should be an old acquaintance of the master here." I need to ask him a few questions." Before I could respond, we heard a muffled noise coming from the storage room. We both turned, and standing in the doorway was the old man we had been following earlier. His wrinkled face squinted as he spotted us, and narrowing his eyes even more, he asked in a gruff voice, "Who are you?" Yorick, suddenly energized, rushed up to him, lifted him into an embrace, and shouted loudly, "You old fool, don't you recognize me?" The old man squinted even harder, staring at Yorick's face, and shook his head. "It's me, Yorick," he added excitedly. "I've finally found a body." The old man's face changed. Surprise flashed across his features, and then, as if struck by lightning, he burst into laughter. "Well, I'll be damned! Never would have guessed." The old man clapped Yorick on the shoulder. "I knew your voice sounded familiar." After that, they embraced, and the old man offered us seats. He glanced over at me and asked, "And who's this?" "This is Michael," Yorick replied, "the master's apprentice." Upon hearing that, the old man frowned. "Has the time come?" he muttered, then turned back to Yorick. "What brings you here?" "Have you seen Mr. Mortimer?" "He's gone missing, and we haven't heard from him in a long time," Yorick asked, a hint of concern creeping into his voice. The old man shook his head. "No, haven't seen him in ages," he said. Yorick looked disappointed, but quickly composed himself and added, "I see. Well, how are you doing? How's life?" "Not bad, but age is catching up with me," the old man chuckled. They talked a bit more about the past, and then Yorick told him about a letter asking for help and a strange feather symbol. The old man shook his head thoughtfully. "The feather? I don't know what it means, but..." He suddenly paused, frowning, as if something had dawned on him. "There's a place you might need to visit, but it could be dangerous. I know someone who caught something strange, and he's keeping the creature at his place. That might be what you're looking for." Yorick lit up with excitement and thanked the old man. We were about to leave when the old man unexpectedly looked at me and said, "I've been waiting for you for a long time. Once, long ago, your master came to me. He left something, saying that if his apprentice ever came, I was to give it to him." With those words, the old man disappeared briefly into a back room and returned with a long wooden case. He placed it on the table, inserted a key into the lock, and opened the lid. Inside lay a cane, seemingly ordinary, but exquisitely carved from wood, with delicate patterns spiraling along its surface. The initials engraved on it were my own. I felt my heart skip a beat. This was the same cane that would belong to me in the future when I became an old man. I had left it with Mr. Mortimer, but now it had come back to me. The old man handed me the cane. "It belongs to you," he said. "This is no ordinary cane. It holds great magical power. Be careful with it." I carefully took the cane, turning it in my hands, feeling its weight and power. After thanking the old man, we left the shop and continued down the street, where the hustle and bustle of the fair was in full swing. As we walked down the street, I couldn't resist asking my companion, "Who was that?" Yorick, still deep in thought about the conversation, glanced back at me. "That was an old merchant named Guido Fellmore. A long time ago, the master saved his life, and they've been friends ever since. Guido specializes in rare and strange magical artifacts." "And why didn't you stop him when we were at the station?" I asked, recalling how the old man had quickly disappeared from sight. Yorick smirked. At the time, he was wearing 7-league boots, one of the rarest artifacts. When you put them on, you can't see or hear anything around you until you reach your destination. That's why I didn't bother stopping him. I nodded, amazed at how many magical artifacts existed in this world. As we continued walking down the busy street, I glanced at the cane, thinking about how unusual it was. From what I remembered, it responded to my thoughts and could change its form, making it an incredibly valuable item. I decided to test it. Thinking of how often I used a simple ballpoint pen, I imagined the cane transforming into one. Before my eyes, it began to shrink, and soon I was holding a pen from a familiar brand I often saw in stores. I marveled at its weight and form. Then I pictured a sword I'd seen in a movie, and within moments the pen started to grow, its surface gleaming as I held a shining blade in my hands. Yorick watched with approval, then said, "Yes, it's indeed a powerful item, but it reveals its full potential when you have extensive knowledge. Remember, in the cave when you summoned the spear that could pierce the demon? You learned about it from an ancient drawing. It all depends on your imagination and what you know." I played around with the cane a bit more, impressed by its abilities, before returning it to its original form, a simple wooden cane with carved patterns. We continued down the alley until we turned into a quieter part of town, where there were far fewer people. The atmosphere changed. It felt heavier, more oppressive. We walked a little further until we reached an old trailer that seemed to radiate something dark. The air was thick with tension, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. We looked around to make sure no one was nearby and approached the closed trailer. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Deciding to investigate further, I circled around the trailer, peering through the windows. In one of them, I spotted an unusual cage. It was intricately crafted, seemingly made of pure gold, with bars that curved elegantly, giving it the appearance of some ancient artifact. Inside the cage sat a large raven. Its feathers gleamed with a glossy black sheen, and its eyes, cold as a moonless night, seemed to be staring directly at me. There was something about this raven that felt too intelligent for a mere bird, and in its gaze, I sensed a hint of menace or a hidden secret. I continued to inspect the room through the window, but didn't notice anything else out of the ordinary. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound from beside me. Turning my head, I saw nothing, but the strange feeling didn't leave me. As I focused back on the room, I realized something had changed. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. Then it hit me. The raven was no longer in the cage. In its place sat a black cat, exactly the same in color and size. I froze in astonishment, trying to comprehend what was happening. Soon, Yorick approached and asked, "What's in there?" "There's a strange creature in the cage," I said, pointing to the cat that had been a raven moments before. "It changes its form." Yorick frowned and, shaking his head, quietly replied, "I've never encountered a creature like that. I don't know what it could be." At that moment, we heard voices. Someone was approaching, and judging by the tone, they were arguing. We hid behind some nearby crates and started watching. 2 men appeared on the path. One was young, about 25 years old. His hair was cropped short, and his skin was pale. He looked a bit anxious, his eyes flashing with irritation, and his movements were sharp. He wore a leather cloak that barely concealed a long sword strapped to his back. The other man was older, around 40. His dark hair was starting to gray at the temples, and his face was lined with wrinkles, bearing a weary but still sharp expression. He wore a tattered brown cloak and old boots. His voice was piercing yet calm, trying to keep the conversation grounded while the younger man threw his words around, as if viewing life as a constant battle. "We can't just sell it like that," the older man said, his voice low but firm. "That's nonsense. Everything we have should bring in profit," the younger one retorted. They approached the trailer and the older man opened the door. I peeked out from our hiding spot and saw that the raven was back in the cage, immediately cawing loudly as soon as the men entered. The younger man snapped angrily. "Shut up, you stupid bird!" His voice was rough, full of rage, and the raven seemed to screech even louder in response. The younger man clenched his fists and took a step toward the cage, clearly intending to open it. "Don't," the older man tried to calm him, but the younger man was already on the verge of losing it. He grabbed the cage's lock, intending to punish the bird. But at the last moment, he stopped, letting go of the lock. The raven continued to caw, but now more quietly, as if realizing its punishment had been postponed. The men resumed their conversation, discussing something about a sale. I kept watching them closely, waiting to see what would happen next. And then, completely out of nowhere, there was a loud explosion from inside the trailer. The room was suddenly filled with thick smoke, and the men inside began coughing loudly, choking as they struggled to figure out what was happening. Out of the fog, figures emerged, dressed entirely in black, their faces obscured by featureless white masks. The moment I saw them, I cursed under my breath. "Damn it, the faceless! They're at it again." These guys were notorious for causing chaos and stirring up trouble that was hard to shake off. One of the faceless held a net while another wielded a whip. As the men inside the trailer coughed, trying to clear their lungs of the smoke, one of the faceless silently threw the net over one of them, and he collapsed to the ground as if paralyzed. The second man was struck with the whip, his body arching in pain before he too fell, drained of all strength. The faceless didn't waste any time. They grabbed the cage with the raven and quickly exited the trailer. Yorick and I exchanged glances. There was no time to lose. Without hesitating, I imagined a whip like the one the faceless had, and my cane immediately transformed into one. As one of them ran past me, I lashed out with the whip, and he dropped to the ground instantly, as if knocked out cold. But the second one, who was carrying the cage, managed to dodge and bolted away. We didn't hesitate. We took off after him through the narrow alleys. I kept the cane whip in hand as Yorick and I raced through the streets, dodging through the crowd of startled onlookers. People stared at us in astonishment, unsure of what was happening. All the while, the raven in the cage kept screeching at the top of its lungs. "Help! They're killing me!" The bird's cries drew even more attention, but the faceless man carrying the cage ignored it, focused solely on escaping. We chased him, darting through the winding streets and narrow alleyways, weaving through people who scrambled out of the way. The raven's terrible cries filled the air, adding even more chaos to the already frantic scene. The faceless man was nimble, expertly weaving between buildings, diving into shadows and dodging obstacles, but we stayed on his tail. Finally, he turned into a quiet alleyway where there were no people. And then, suddenly, he vanished. We skidded to a stop, looking around. The alley was empty, no trace of him, as if he'd evaporated into thin air. "Where did he go?" I asked, scanning the area and peeking under parked trailers. But there was no sign of him. Then I heard it, the raven's voice again, now filled with terror. "Help! Please help!" We bolted toward the sound and, looking up, spotted the faceless man hiding on the roof of one of the trailers. He stood there clutching the cage, preparing to make another run for it. Without hesitation, he took off again, leaping from rooftop to rooftop, desperately trying to escape. We chased the faceless through the narrow alleys until we finally cornered him against a stone wall leading into a cave. Realizing he was trapped, he frantically looked around for a way out. It was a moment of pure desperation. Suddenly, without hesitation, he pulled a powder from his pocket and threw it in front of him. A portal appeared, but something was off. The light emanating from it flickered, unstable, as if the portal could lead anywhere. Without a second thought, the faceless jumped into it, and despite our hesitation, we followed. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I felt was the cold, damp air. Thick fog surrounded us, and the sky above was overcast, threatening rain. We had landed in a cemetery. Trees, mostly willows, stood like phantoms, their long branches hanging down, almost touching the ground as if trying to cover the old, crooked headstones. Low grass, intertwined with fallen autumn leaves, grew between the graves. Some were overgrown with moss and weeds, while others looked newer, with crisp inscriptions on the tombstones. The faceless had vanished. We started looking around, trying to find any sign of him, but there was nothing, only silence, broken by the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. The cemetery stretched out in all directions, endless, shrouded in mist, amplifying the growing sense of unease. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise, like something rustling in the grass nearby. I froze and looked around, noticing that the fallen leaves and grass were starting to move, as if something underneath was trying to break free. My heart raced, and the realization hit me. There was only one explanation: zombies. I'd seen them in movies before, but the reality was far worse. A decayed hand burst through the soil. Its skin was rotting, hanging off in places, revealing bone. A nauseating stench filled the air. What horror movies tried to hide was now unfolding in front of me in grotesque detail. The zombies looked far more repulsive in real life. Rotting flesh, lifeless eyes clouded with emptiness. A chill ran down my spine. "Run!" Yorick shouted, and we bolted, not waiting to see the creature fully emerge from its grave. We raced across the cemetery, leaping over old tombstones until we reached the center. There stood a massive crypt, its grand architecture defying time. On the roof sat the faceless, and next to him was the black cat that had once been screeching. Now it sat calmly, as if under some kind of spell. Squinting, I noticed something around the cat's neck, a medallion. Small and metallic, it glinted darkly in the fog. Made of tarnished silver, it was inscribed with unfamiliar symbols that seemed to faintly glow with a soft, barely noticeable light. At the center of the medallion was a small red stone, pulsing like a heartbeat. The cage lay discarded nearby on the ground. The faceless was muttering something quietly in a language I couldn't understand. Suddenly, the cat let out a sharp meow, and at that moment, I felt an invisible wave pulse through the air. My hair stood on end, as if hit by a sudden gust of wind, and Yorick, looking uneasy, muttered, "Something bad's about to happen. I can feel it." Then I heard it. The familiar sound of rustling and shuffling, coming from all directions. I turned and saw it. Zombies were rising from their graves. One by one, hands clawed through the earth, grasping at the grass and leaves. Some bodies were already halfway out of their graves, filthy and half-decayed, their empty eyes staring directly at us. My heart pounded in my chest. The terror I felt was beyond anything I could describe. My entire body was gripped with icy fear. I saw one zombie fully rise from the ground. its tattered clothes hanging from its rotting body, and it let out a raspy groan, as if struggling for every breath. All around us, the nightmare was just beginning, and I had the sickening feeling that this was only the start of something far more horrific. The zombies were slowly approaching, their decaying bodies moving forward, and even though they weren't fast, there were far too many of them. I knew that if even one of them got close enough to grab me, escaping would be impossible. They moved with relentless certainty, their feet shuffling along the ground, leaving trails of rot behind. I glanced over at Yorick, feeling panic beginning to rise within me, and asked, "What are we going to do?" He quickly scanned the area, weighing our options, and suddenly said, "Search in the pouch. There should be a music box that can help us." Without hesitation, I shoved my hand into my spatial pouch, desperately trying to feel for the box. The creatures were getting closer, and each passing second felt like an eternity. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I realized there wasn't much time left. "Hurry up!" Yorick shouted, turning back to me. "Just call out its name!" "You didn't tell me its name!" I snapped back, still frantically digging through the pouch. He looked back at me, surprised. "I thought you knew. It's called Elaine's box." The name sparked a memory. I had seen it in one of the reference guides, but I hadn't remembered right away. There were thousands of items, but now it came back to me. This box had once belonged to a woman named Elaine, who lived in England during the 16th century. She collected music boxes and once found one that could put everyone around it to sleep. Elaine and her gang used it to rob houses until they were all caught and hanged. It was a creepy story, but I also remembered that the box had another power. It could cleanse evil spirits. "Elaine's box!" I shouted. Instantly, I felt it in my hand, as if it had always been there. Wasting no time, I pulled it out, and without opening it, yelled to Yorick, "It's ready!" He rushed over to me, and together we touched the box, opening it. The lid lifted gently, and out sprang a miniature angel, finely carved from ivory, its wings shimmering as it began to slowly spin above the box as if it had come to life. At the same moment, a melody began to play, soft but piercing, reaching deep into the soul. It was a melody you would never forget, quiet, tender, like the whisper of the wind at dawn, yet powerful, like life itself. The zombies, who were now nearly upon us, suddenly froze. Their decaying bodies began to tremble, as if an invisible force was acting upon them. The melody seeped into the very essence of their being, tearing apart the dark energy that sustained them in this world. The first zombie, closest to us, began to crumble. First its hands, then its arms and legs. Its body was literally turning to dust, carried away by the wind. The other zombies started to collapse to the ground like rag dolls. They didn't scream or resist. They simply fell, as if overwhelmed by a force too great to bear. Each note of the melody, each vibration, was breaking their unholy connection to life. The ones farther away slowed down at first, then dropped to their knees, as if weakened by something invisible. Some of them simply disintegrated, their bodies turning to ash as though they had never existed. Others fell as if they had been put to sleep, their eyes closing, and their bodies lying still on the ground. The melody continued to play, and with every new chord, more and more zombies vanished, as if their very existence was being erased by the pure energy of the music. I stood there, stunned by what was happening, feeling the world around us being cleansed. Yorick, a bit disheveled by the sudden surge of power, merely nodded, knowing the box had fulfilled its purpose. When the last zombie collapsed to the ground, it seemed like it was all over. I exhaled in relief, thinking the danger had passed. I turned, expecting to see the faceless one unconscious, but to my surprise, the music box had no effect on him. He continued murmuring his incantations in a monotone, as if everything happening around him didn't concern him at all. I realized that through all this time, he hadn't stopped once. Suddenly, the eyes of the cat sitting in the cage began to glow brightly, and its black fur stood on end, as if some kind of magical energy was coursing through it. I felt something change, and a sense of dread clenched my heart. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble, and a deep roar echoed through the air as a fissure opened up right in front of us. I barely managed to keep my balance, stepping back to avoid falling. From the crack in the earth, bright green beams of light shot out, dazzling and blinding. This wasn't just ordinary light. It carried an inexplicable sense of danger, as though the earth itself was giving birth to something ancient and malevolent. From the depths of the ground, through cracks and fiery bursts, a massive figure began to emerge. The first thing I saw was huge claws, dark and sharp as if forged from ancient dried-out bones saturated with magic. They dug into the edges of the fissure, ripping rocks and gravel from the earth. With each passing moment, more and more of this creature rose from beneath the ground. Its body was covered in scales as black as coal, shimmering under the glow of the magical light. The demon was emerging slowly, but with each second its size became more and more staggering. It was gigantic, its massive body towering above us like a living mountain. Muscles rippled beneath its scaly skin as if it had been created solely for destruction. Its long tail, lined with spikes, twisted like a giant serpent, and crooked horns jutted from its back, reaching upwards like sharp peaks. But the most horrifying feature was its face. It looked like a grotesque mask, with two enormous glowing eyes, burning bright green like they came straight from the depths of hell. Its mouth was filled with jagged, uneven teeth, resembling shards of ancient bones. Every time it opened its maw, steam poured out, as if searing energy boiled within it. The creature let out a low, bestial growl that vibrated through the air so intensely that the trees around us swayed as if struck by a hurricane's wind. The ground trembled beneath us once again, and I realized that this wasn't just a demon. It was something far more evil and powerful. Its roar was so loud that I felt the blood freeze in my veins, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Yorick and I both understood we were in serious trouble. This demon was far too powerful, and its malevolent energy filled the air around us. Something told me that we didn't stand a chance against this demon. Judging by the look of terror on Yorick's face, he thought the same. We slowly began to back away, trying to avoid drawing the creature's attention, but it soon became clear that the beast had noticed us. Its glowing, fiery eyes locked onto us, and it took a step forward, each of its steps so powerful that the ground beneath us shook. One of its strides was like 5 of mine. In desperation, I opened my pouch and started frantically going through my things, searching for anything that might help. Pulling out a Rubik's Cube, I remembered it had a couple of used faces with magical effects. In a panic, I quickly aligned them and threw the cube right at the demon. But to my horror, the effect was completely unexpected. The demon began to grow, its body increasing in size, and it seemed to become even stronger. I cursed under my breath, realizing I had only made things worse. "Damn it!" Yorick yelled, clearly panicking. "I just became human again and don't want to turn back into a skull!" The demon was approaching, and I was sure this was the end. But suddenly a bolt of lightning shot into the sky, striking the demon directly. The creature staggered and stopped, looking around in confusion. I followed its gaze and saw that we were surrounded by people wearing red cloaks. There were many of them, and among them I saw faces of different ages and genders. Some of them were looking directly at me, while others focused on the demon, preparing to attack. These people began pulling out various magical items and launched an assault on the demon. Despite its size and power, the demon began to falter under the onslaught of attacks. Its roar grew weaker and its movements became less confident. It seemed like victory was within reach. But suddenly, as if in a fit of rage, the creature let out a roar so powerful that a wave of energy erupted across the battlefield, knocking everyone back. I was almost thrown off my feet and barely managed to stay upright. Everyone scrambled to get back up and rejoin the fight, but the demon was in a fury. One man, in his 40s with a thick beard, pulled a small hammer from under his cloak. Suddenly, the hammer began to grow in size until it was as large as a house. I couldn't understand how he held it, but the man seemed unaffected by its weight. He charged forward and struck the demon with all his might. The blow was devastating, sending the demon flying backward, crashing into the ground with the force of a collapsing mountain. But the demon wasn't defeated. It got back to its feet, breathing heavily but still ready to continue the battle. I was frantically trying to think of a way to help defeat the demon when I suddenly remembered the very spear I had used once before. Focusing on its image in my mind, I felt my cane begin to transform. It elongated. The metal on its surface darkened, and the tip grew massive and crimson as if burning with a blood-red energy. Now, in my hand, I held a spear with a giant red blade. I spotted the man with the hammer, which had already returned to its normal size, and I shouted to him, pointing at the spear. He seemed to immediately understand my plan. He rushed over, grabbed the spear from my hands, and with incredible strength, hurled it straight into the demon's chest. The spear flew like lightning, and when it pierced the creature's body, a bright red energy surged through it. The demon let out a roar so loud that the ground beneath us quaked. Cracks spread across its scaly skin, and energy began to burst from them, destroying it from within. In the next moment, the creature began to disintegrate, turning into dust that was carried away by the wind. Cheers of victory echoed all around. Wasting no time, I ran toward the faceless one, but several of the red-cloaked people had already captured him before I could reach him. As I got closer, I saw that the cat was still sitting nearby. Carefully, I removed the medallion from its neck, and in that instant, the cat came to life. It looked around in confusion, and then, upon noticing that the faceless one was caught, finally calmed down. It gazed at me, then transformed back into a raven and flew up to perch on my shoulder. I stroked it, sensing the tension leave its body. At that moment, the man with the hammer, the one who had thrown the spear, approached us. He handed me the spear and said with gratitude, "Excellent work. Thank you for your help." I shook my head in response. "On the contrary, you saved us. We should be the ones thanking you." As soon as I took hold of the spear, it transformed back into a cane. The man raised an eyebrow in surprise, but said nothing, choosing to remain silent. Then he introduced himself. "My name is Marcus Englewood. I'm part of the Order of Watchers." Yorick had mentioned this order before. It was the very organization responsible for monitoring magical artifacts and creatures to prevent them from getting out of control. Marcus continued, "We heard about the commotion at the fair and tracked the portal you used. It took some time, but we managed to follow it here. As it turns out, we weren't too late. That demon was far more dangerous than we expected. He nodded toward the raven, and after a moment of hesitation asked, "Does this creature belong to you?" I paused for a second before deciding to tell the truth. It was being held captive by two people, but this creature has a right to its freedom. Marcus seemed like he wanted to argue for a moment, but then thought better of it. Perhaps he knew I was Mr. Mortimer's apprentice and didn't want to provoke a conflict. After that, the members of the order began cleaning up the graveyard, restoring the destroyed tombs, and dispelling the lingering magical energy. Marcus bid us farewell, and the group of watchers disappeared, leaving Yorick and me standing alone in the now peaceful cemetery. "Well," Yorick sighed, "seems like we've stirred up trouble again." I couldn't disagree with him. Then I turned to the raven perched on my shoulder. "So, was it you who sent the letter asking for help?" The raven opened its beak and, to my astonishment, began speaking clearly and confidently, as though I was talking to a professor rather than a bird. "Yes, it was me. I was lucky. A woman helped me when those two were distracted. I knew Mr. Mortimer would come to save me," it said. "I see." I nodded, still processing everything that had happened. I asked a new question. "If you don't mind, could you tell me why they wanted to capture you?" The raven looked at me carefully and began to explain. "It's because of my powers. As you may have noticed, in the form of a cat, I can control spirits and act as a medium of sorts. I have a connection to the vast world of spirits, which makes me a unique target. In the form of a raven, I have other abilities, such as moving quickly across vast distances." I listened in amazement, realizing just how powerful this creature was. The ability to control spirits and teleport across the world instantly, these were incredible talents. "Can you transform into anything else?" I asked. The raven suddenly shrank and transformed into a butterfly. It fluttered in the air for a moment before shifting back into its raven form. "I could have easily escaped the cage," it said, "but the cage was enchanted and suppressed my powers." "Well, that's something," I muttered, more impressed by the creature's capabilities than ever. Yorick, taking advantage of the pause, asked his question. "We don't actually know where Mr. Mortimer is right now. You mentioned you have the power of a medium. Could you help us find him?" The raven thought for a moment, then transformed back into a cat. Its eyes began to glow brightly, and after a few moments it spoke again. "I've found him. He's in the afterlife, and it seems he's in danger." Yorick and I exchanged worried glances. We knew we were facing a serious challenge ahead. The raven looked at us intently, waiting for our decision.